Hi, this is Claudia Azula Altucher, your host of the Yoga Podcast. And I am thrilled that for this very first episode, I have none other than David Keil for a guest. He has just released a book that is called Functional Anatomy of Yoga, a guide for practitioners and teachers. David started practicing yoga in 1989 as a suggestion from his Tai Chi teacher. And then he was also an instructor of kinesiology at Miami's Educating Hand School of Massage. That was from 1999 to 2003. And in between those years, in 2001, he met John Scott, whom he recognizes as his own yoga teacher. And the funny thing is, when he met John Scott actually asked him to keep coming back to do a portion of his own yoga teacher training on anatomy. And David did that and continues to do that to this day, as well as teaching workshops all over the world. Also in 2002, David did his first trip to Mysore to visit Sri K. Patavi Joyce, who is the founder of the Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga system. And since then, he has returned many times with his wife, Gretchen. David, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for such a great introduction.
So, at the risk of sounding a little cheesy, I'm going to say I have a bone to pick with you.
Okay. Pun intended, right?
Yes. Here's the thing. After reading Functional Anatomy of Yoga, my practice has slowed down a lot because every little thing I do now, I'm thinking, oh, wait, that's what he meant. And then I go, oh, wait. Oh, yeah, I feel it now. And so as a consequence, it's so long I don't have a life anymore. So what do you have to say?
Well, I think it's a good thing if you're slowing down and thinking about what you're doing and how you're doing it, and even more importantly, why you're doing it. So
that's right. I agree with that. The why is very important. And there are so many aha moments that I've been having. It's actually incredible. So let me ask you, would it be fair to say that you have a superpower of X-ray vision when you look at students?
Yes. I purchased that at Walmart about 10 years ago. Oh, wow. Yeah, definitely, I think one of my my skills is to observe and to sit back and watch and see how people are moving and where they're moving from and how they're moving, and then work with that.
Right. And I'm usually interested because every superhero, even if you buy it at Walmart, has an origin story. So what's yours? What brought you into yoga and into anatomy, which is sort of an obscure side, you could say?
Yeah. Well, as you said in the introduction, I came to yoga through my Tai Chi teacher back in 1989, who I'm still in touch with. And that wasn't my introduction to Ashtanga yoga, which is my current practice. But that kicked things off. And then I went off to university where I did not study anatomy. Actually, I have a degree in business. And having done Tai Chi and yoga before that and other stuff at the time in high school, I would just classify things as either self-help or new age stuff. So I've always kind of had this bend towards spirituality. Mm-hmm. And so by the time I got back from university, I thought I wanted to be an acupuncture physician. And what happened was I moved into going to massage school as a vehicle to kind of get me into the healthcare profession, et cetera. And this is, of course, where I first was introduced to very specific anatomy. Mm-hmm. And what happened for me was something that you're saying happened to you after you read my book, which is I started having these aha moments and these realizations and connections to my yoga practice. So that's where things started to sort of come together, for lack of a better word. And by the time I finished massage school, I realized I didn't want to be an acupuncture physician.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and I went on to do chronic pain relief work, dealing with people who had been in pain for anywhere from 1 year to 20 years and trying to work out, what was going on in them. And it was around that time that I also was introduced to Ashtanga and where I was working things out on the mat in a very different way than I had been before that. And really, it's kind of like three things started to come together, or in a way from 3 points of view. One was having an anatomical knowledge. Number two was doing a yoga practice. And three was working on people, on living tissue.
Right.
And so these three things were they just kept swimming around in my head. And this is what started to inform, my own practice and deepen my understanding of anatomy, not just from the static point of view, but from the functional point of view.
Mm-hmm. And to this day, you continue to do the yoga practice. Clearly, it has been, you find benefits to it. It has...
Oh, yeah. It continues to evolve. I say to students that we're all kind of going through our own process. Our body's going through a process of opening or closing or strengthening or loosening. And it's this constant play.
Mm-hmm.
It's what happens is we tend to think of things being more static because it's a simpler way to understand things. Oh, I'm going to stretch my hamstrings, or oh, I'm going to strengthen my quadriceps, or whatever the case may be. But these things are in relationship to one another, and it's a process of change over time.
Yes. And what I like about the way you present it is that I've seen you even in other interviews, and there are some generalizations that I've heard in certain yoga classes where, for example, teachers will say, well, put your foot in a certain position. And I've seen you say, well, I question why, because when you look at each individual body, things may be completely different, and what we think may be the correct thing may not necessarily be the thing for everybody.
Yeah, I'm much more interested in teaching the individual than I am coming up with a generalized cue or direction for every student. And it's difficult because, of course, you have to start with the general anyway. There's
Right.
I don't think there's any way around that. It's not a bad thing, because 80% of the people in your room it's going to be the correct thing for them. But, I kind of stand up for the 20%. And it's also, I don't know, when I teach, I'm very much interested in having a relationship with the students that I teach. Uh-huh. So I set my classes up in a particular way that allows me to have that relationship. So
I believe you teach 5 people at the time, is that right?
When I'm teaching in my home, yes, it's 5 students. And when I travel, and this is, of course, limited to the actual asana class, I limit the number to 12 students. And they also have to sign up for 5 days in a row of practice. Mm. And by doing this, I create a certain commitment from them, but also a commitment from myself. And it allows just enough time to have a relationship, to see things, start to change things, see if it's working or not working, because
Right.
I also don't assume that I'm always right.
Right. Which is critical in a way when you think about it.
Yes, of course.
To remove the ego and sort of like just see what is actually happening. And you say this in the book, without the projection that I may be putting onto the body of the person I'm looking at.
Yeah. And what's happened is, going back to your point about the generalized instruction, is we've said them so many times, or we've heard them so many times, that they have biased us.
Right.
We assume that they are correct. And what happens is then we miss out on the person who actually needs a different instruction.
Yes.
Yes.
True.
And because we're all having our own process and unfolding, it might not be quite the right time for that instruction. Like maybe it's a month away, maybe it's a year away for a particular person. I often tell students, well, you've been doing it that way. It's worked for you, but it's now time to evolve, change, move on from that instruction.
You have a very funny story in the book where you say, what is it I hear you say? You've been trying this posture for years and it's still not working. And then you say, don't you think it might be a time right now to perhaps change your approach to? And it made me laugh because that's me. I keep trying the same things. And just like the definition of madness, I expect a different result. And so it's a great resource in a way to open your eyes to the anatomy, to understand what's happening inside the body. Now, let me ask you, you see thousands of people in your workshops because you go all over the world. So you have a pretty big sample of the population, even though, in all fairness, these are practitioners of yoga. But if you had to say 3 common misalignments that we as a people have, what would you say from an anatomy point of view? What would you say those are, if you can come up with 3?
Yeah. Well, probably the most common anatomical misalignment that the majority of people have is a pelvic misalignment. Either one side or the other is tilted more forward or more back than the other. And it's an important place. I might just leave it at that one, because you can branch off from the pelvis and go in any direction. You can go up into the spine, you can go down into the legs. And sometimes this is really at the root of a number of issues. Mm-hmm. Because if you go up into the spine, then it might show up as lower back pain, or issues around the spine, or even sacroiliac joint dysfunction or irritation or whatever. And if you go down, if one side of your pelvis is tilted, then it could lead to one hamstring being constantly in a state of lengthening, and it might get irritated. Like sit bone pain is a very common problem. And sometimes it's stemming from a pelvic misalignment. Right, and the pelvis is what we commonly know as the hips, in more gross form, right? Yeah, that's where it is. Yes. Yes, I'll accept that. As an anatomist, it's hard for me to agree, but yes. Thank you for agreeing with me. Yes, no problem. Anytime. And so that's one. Do you have any other misalignment that you see that are sort of common? Or would you say perhaps this is the main one? I mean, I don't know. I think it's a good place to, from an anatomical point of view, it's the one. If we start looking at things that tend to happen in yoga, it's usually less to do with sort of anatomical misalignment, and more likely to be trying to do something and putting yourself in alignment that's not appropriate for you. Oh, do I hear you saying forcing? In essence, yes. It can be more subtle than forcing. Could it be showing off? Because I do that. I definitely want to show off. And now after reading your book, I can't. Yeah, I've ruined the showing off part. Yeah. The way I've been saying it lately is it's a fine balance, right? You have to put some effort in, and you have to try things. Right. But if you try things to the point where you're really not being yourself, and I mean that anatomically, it could go beyond that too, but really I mean anatomically, it's as if, and this comes up a lot, people watch a lot of videos on YouTube and on the internet to learn things, which is great. Mm-hmm. The part that sometimes misses the point is you're not that person's body. So even though that technique might be fantastic and great for them, the question for the individual who's trying it has to be, well, does this really fit my body or not? And that's a hard question to answer. Right, yes. And that's what I mean by not being yourself anatomically, and in a sense that is, forcing things, but unconsciously, it's not on purpose. Right. Yeah. Right, you're trying to imitate perhaps, and trying to get it right. And there is a lot of humility also that comes, for example, for me in a posture like a revolved triangle, where I'm used to having legs straight and suddenly having to bend one of the legs just to experience, say, proper rotation, or it doesn't matter what pose it is, but just having to adjust a little bit so that the pose will actually kick in is humbling, because I tend to think of myself, perhaps subconsciously, as this great yogi, right? Why not? Why not? Which is not true at all. It's completely my ego. But it's a good exercise in coming back to basics and saying, wait a minute, what is actually happening in my body right now? And how can I make it effective? How can I make it real? Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good thing. definitely.
One thing that you mentioned, and I'm glad you brought up the pelvis and the area of the hips, because I learned by reading you that the hips support 2/3 of the weight of our body. And we used to be, a couple of billion years ago, we used to go on 4 legs, and now we're on 2 legs. And so this, as a consequence, it supports the hips have all this weight. And
Yes.
so what can we do to just not hurt ourselves just by the fact that we're humans?
Well, I mean, thankfully, because the 2 million billion year thing has happened over such a long period of time, our body has fairly well adapted to going upright. And I, it's interesting. I don't think the hip joint itself is one of the most commonly injured ones. It's one that's tight very commonly. You might have sensation and pain around it, but the joint itself doesn't get injured. And that's partly true because it does carry such a significant amount of our body weight, and the ligaments around it are so dense for this reason. That's why it can handle the amount of weight that it does. So it's not so much that the hips are going to get injured. It's more like when they're tight or dysfunctioning, they're going to send out potentially injuries to other places. And as I talk about in the book, of course, the knee is one of the most common places to get injured from very tight hips.
Right. That's right. Yes. So, for example, I see when I teach classes, there is a tendency to try to do the Lotus Pose, where you cross your legs and one leg is on top of the other, and very fast. And sometimes I see it disrespecting the knee a little bit, but it's not really a knee issue. What is that about?
Well, yeah, in that sense, if you've created the right patterns before doing Lotus quickly, then hopefully you'll be okay.
Right.
And more likely than not, you will be okay. But it's kind of the way I say it is the knee is sitting in the middle of the ankle below it and the hip joint above it.
Right.
And so it's taking forces potentially from either of those two ends. And it's very common to have tight hips. That's both going forward, backward, sideways, and rotating in all directions, because we stand and we walk, and a lot of people do activities such as cycling and running and CrossFit or whatever the case may be, all of which are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. But they create a certain pattern in your body, and then you try to put a pattern of Lotus on top of that, and sometimes they run into each other. So the force of, or I should say, the tension surrounding the hip joint that doesn't allow it to move fully into the position that we would want it to be in Lotus has a tendency to cause stress in the knee.
Right. Right. So is that the hip really, is working with the hip will help the knee?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
even
yes.
the ankle.
Even the ankle, right?
Yeah, most cases with the ankle in Lotus where it's stressed and pulling on the outer edge of it, it's usually because the foot can't be in the right position, but it's not because of the ankle. It's because following it back, it's between the knee and the hip that are, and ultimately the hip that's not allowing everything to rotate enough so that the foot is high enough so that it's not getting compressed and squeezed and painful.
That's right. So for anyone who's listening who may do a lot of biking or running, would it be fair to say then yoga sort of postures that work on lengthening and opening the hips would be a blessing?
Yes. I'll give one caveat to that, which is if you plan on running and cycling at a very high level, then you don't want to open your hips too much, because then your running or cycling could be affected and you could cause other problems while doing that activity.
Interesting.
Yeah, because again, the body, when we train the body to do a certain thing, it's building up a pattern of movement and muscular strength and tension, etc., around that particular pattern that we're wanting to do. So if you undo too much of that pattern, when you go back to doing that pattern, other things can run into trouble.
Right. So do enough so as to keep a certain balance, but don't go, like if you're training for a triathlon or something like that,
Right.
respect the fact that that's the form you're going for, and use yoga as a complement, perhaps to balance things a little bit. Is that what I'm...
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
So another thing that really caught my attention from your book is the spine. I finally learned where the spine, the nervous system goes through in the spine, and the actual cord, and how it's protected by the spine. And you take a leap on page 36, and I love how you say, what is yoga at the end of the day? Is it because some teachers say even if you do just the poses and if you focus on just the body, then you might as well do gymnastics. But you propose, even if it's stripped down to a physical form, yoga has the power to change people physically, mentally, and emotionally, because the nervous system. And can you talk about that? Because I found that very interesting, how the body can actually bring you within.
It's I really like talking about that part, actually. And
Good.
The way I say it is, yoga is ultimately about the nervous system. Whether you're doing one end of the spectrum, which I'll just say is meditation, or the other end of the spectrum, which is an asana practice, or the physical postures. If you sit quietly, you're going to come into contact with your nervous system, whether it be wiggling around and not being able to sit still or comfortable, and an anxiousness or an anxiety, which is, of course, from the nervous system, or you're confronting your mind, which is, you could say, I don't like to say the mind is the nervous system. It's certainly more than that, but in some ways the mind is a reflection of the nervous system. A reflection might be a better word. Like, of course, we can track, we can do functional MRIs and say the word orange and watch people's, brain light up, because, of course, the neurons are firing with a particular thought. And what happens is you have one thought, and, of course, one thought leads to another thought, leads to another thought, leads to another thought, because...
And you're gone, yes.
And, yeah, you're gone. You've written a novel in your mind, yes. And it's just like you're who knows where you are. You're miles away. And this is both a function of the mind, and it's also mappable within the brain itself and neurons firing, because it's thousands of neurons that are contained within a thought, and
right.
Some of those are associated with other neurons that would lead to other thoughts, and that's how we kind of follow that pathway. I mean, that's it in very simplistic form. The other end of the spectrum being an asana or physical practice. Well, how are you moving your body? Through your nervous system. How are you experiencing what's going on in your body? Also through your nervous system. In fact, everything is experienced through your nervous system.
Yes.
So if you're taking your day-to-day patterns, whether they be physical, mental, emotional, whatever, and you're doing a physical activity over and over again, you're training your nervous system.
That's right.
And I guess it's like, it doesn't matter which way you get into it, you're going to have to get into it within yoga. And it's not, I don't know that the physical will last a lifetime of continuing to evolve things. At some point, I think it's quite natural, and I see this over and over and again with students, is, through long periods of time doing a physical practice, you start to pay closer and closer attention to things. Or you read, my book, and all of a sudden you're really paying attention to things,
right.
And it's slowing down your practice. And really, this is what yoga is about. It's about being present with what's going on in the moment.
It made me think, David, when I was practicing very slowly with all the aha moments, how in a way I felt that I was going from the most gross sort of form of my body to a more sort of inner, so a more subtle way of understanding. Because if I'm thinking of just my leg goes there is one thing, but if I'm thinking of and feeling a muscle, suddenly I'm going closer within. And it seems to me that it is a way to go into more subtle areas of the bodies, finding muscles, finding details.
Well, what happens is you're more concentrated
Right.
because you're giving your mind something to focus on.
Right.
And as a result, the thoughts that would come up to distract you from where you are
like
gone.
breakfast.
Like breakfast or lunch. It's
Right.
usually food, isn't it?
It's food, yeah.
I mean, I think it can go too far as well. I mean, I'm at the point in my own practice where I only interact with the anatomy from an intellectual point of view during my practice if something feels off, if something doesn't feel quite right, because I'd like to think, I'm holding up my fingers in quotations, I'd like to think that I've created good, healthy patterns in my practice. And so now it's more finding where things are off of that typical pattern and then looking into that a little bit more closely. Or if I've tweaked something, I've heard something, my back's a little sore today, so I'm paying closer attention to it and wondering what's going on perhaps. But at some point it should all fall away.
Right. So you're saying there is hope for me. I mean, this will pass. All of these aha moments and all the new excitement over the practice. Eventually, when I sort of retrain my nervous system into the right patterns, perhaps I'll find myself in a deeper, more concentrated place with the anatomy sort of taking care of itself, unless there is an injury or something is bothering. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, you got it just right. Yeah.
And you also tie this up to the definition that Patanjali gives of yoga, which is yoga. You want to say it?
Yogas chitta vritti nirodha.
That's
that
right,
one?
but that's Sanskrit, and we want English because.
Oh. Yeah. Yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind, of
That's right.
of the mental stuff. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but it's more to do with following those thoughts, being attached to those thoughts, believing the stories that we tell ourselves. It's more in that direction than just, most people think, yoga's about stopping your mind or something. And that's not true. And it's not about not thinking.
That's very difficult. I've never found the off switch.
Yeah. It's not easy to find. It's buried.
Right.
Yeah.
Perhaps
Yes.
in more subtle levels as we keep practicing.
Yeah, it's there, and I think a lot of it comes back to finding something to concentrate on.
Right.
It doesn't have to be anatomy. It could be your breath. It could be your nose. It could be your toe. Whatever it is for the type of practice you do, the concentration over a long period of time is what ceases the identification with those thoughts in your mind.
I like how you put that. Yes.
Yes.
Concentration for a long period of time. That is what ceases all the chattering and perhaps gives you a chance to become present, to be here, to be now with an open heart.
Yes, for sure. It's what all the books say, actually.
Yeah, I'm not enlightened, unfortunately.
Nor am I. Nor do I know exactly what that means anyway.
Oh, good. We're together in the same boat then.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
good to know. So, David, a lot of people complain about wrist pain because they're sitting on computers. I know I am, even though I do yoga. We have to. And you have in your website a $1 million tip about wrist pain. And I am wondering if you would be willing to share it for free right here.
The $1 million tip.
Yes. Is $1 million.
Do I need to go to my website to find it? You want to give me a hint?
Sure. You say that the hip, the wrist sometimes gets in trouble because we flex it too much, and so there is something that has to do with ice.
Yeah. I recently got in trouble on Facebook.
Oh no!
For talking about ice.
Really?
For inflammation. Because there's this whole new, there's a lot of research regarding inflammation and pain and the anti-inflammatory response. And I still didn't quite feel like anybody understood what I was saying, and it seemed misunderstood. So I'm going to give the $1 million tip anyway, because I've seen it work so many times.
Yes, that's what I like, that you've seen it work. So I believe you. So
yeah,
I'll take it.
I've had many people who show up with wrist pain, And what I simply have them do is ice their arm above their elbow for 7 to 10 minutes once a day for 5 days, something along those lines. You just fill up your sink with water and ice. It's not easy to keep your arm
I
under
imagine.
ice water for 6 or 7. Oh, you haven't tried it yet?
I haven't tried it yet. No, I'm scared. It's my
you have-
next challenge.
That's going to be the ice dunk challenge of tomorrow,
Of the
I guess.
yoga community.
Yeah. And you just dunk your arm in there. I always tell people, oh, put on a couple of good songs that you know and that you like. And of
So
course,
you can sing along.
yeah, sing along and try to not focus on what's going on with your forearm.
Because what's going to happen?
Well-
What do you feel?
Well, what happens is you go through a few stages. First is shock.
Yeah, I imagine that.
Yeah. And then it starts to go into a slightly tingly, painful sensation. And then it starts to go numb. You don't want to do it for more than 10 minutes ever. You don't want to do it over and over and over again for long periods of time. But what it does is one ice creates a system response, and it floods out the fluid, right? Because we are fluid based, it pushes all the fluid from your forearm out, and then of course after you take your arm out of it, blood's going to flow back in more fully. So in a way, you're creating a pump.
I see.
You're getting rid of, fluid, and with the fluid goes metabolic waste products, all kinds of stuff. And then you put the fresh stuff in. So that's my $1 million tip. I've never heard it that way, but it sounds good.
Yeah, I'm going to try it actually, because I do get a little bit of wrist pain, and I know it's because of the way I'm using the computer. So I'll let you know when I write a post about this. I'll write about the tip and how it went for me.
Okay, sounds good.
The feet are our foundation, and we were talking earlier about the hips and how important they are, because as we stand upright from being babies, then the hips that were at the level of the ground are now sort of like our second feet, and the feet become the base of the body. So they're really important for you from an anatomy point of view. The way they're, and I learned they have 3 arches, and I thought there was only 1.
Yeah, most people are familiar with just the one on the inside of the foot, but there are definitely 3. There's one across the outer edge of the foot, and then there's one that basically connects the base of your big toe to the base of your little toe.
That's right. And you gave a tip, and I wonder, I don't know, you tell me. Whenever I'm on a standing position, you say lift your toes. Is this a good tip for all standing positions to make sure that the leg is somewhat well aligned?
I think it's especially good for beginners. The exception to doing it is probably balancing postures.
I see.
Yeah, if you're in a balancing posture on one foot and one leg, if you lift your toes, it's quite possible that will knock you off balance.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good. It's a good way to connect with the quality of the arches. I don't impose lifting the toes on all postures all the time with all of my students, but if you have arches that are lower than you think they should be, it's a good idea to do it at least for a period of time. And just more for the quality that's created out of lifting the toes and generating the arch. That's what I prefer to take away from it. Not that it has to be lifted all the time.
Right. So to sort of get an idea of other than imbalancing postures, would you say this is especially good maybe for someone with flat feet to become more aware of the arches?
Yeah, absolutely.
I see.
Absolutely.
So,
And you mentioned alignment, and for some people lifting the toes, it definitely can change the positioning of the body parts above it. Most people don't realize that their quadriceps are engaged when they lift their toes. In fact, it's almost impossible to lift your toes with straight legs and not engage your quadriceps.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and so it points out how interrelated the whole leg is.
Right.
Not just a foot, not just a knee, not just a hip, but a leg.
Yeah, for me,
Yeah.
the awakening moment there was also all the tiny muscles, or well, not so tiny, but the muscles around the lower leg, around the, from the knee to the ankle, all
Yeah.
those muscles light up when you bend the toes, and I found it a revelation.
Yeah. Um, we're more familiar with the bigger, gross muscles like quadriceps and hamstrings. We talk about them more often. Maybe we know something about the calf muscles, but the muscles that are deep to the calf or on the front of the shin we might know they're there, but we don't know so much about what they do and how they function.
Right. Yes, that's very true. So, my husband yesterday, James, he goes to me. We're talking about yoga. He's really excited. He just got onto a headstand, so he's very happy. And he says to me, "You must. It's a lucky thing to be a girl because your hips are more open because women have babies."
Right.
Is there truth to that, or is that an urban myth?
I think as a generalization, women's hips do tend to be more open. That is the hip joint itself. Not always, but men also generally have stronger shoulders. So it's a little bit of give and take there.
So then for arm balances, for example, he would have an advantage over a female.
Yes, it depends on for how many years he's been hunched over a computer, but generally, yes, he's at an advantage for the arm balances.
He's gonna like that.
I'll bet.
And since you mentioned being hunched over a computer, which is what I was just doing until I remember whom I'm talking to, you have in one of your DVDs, you tell a wonderful story about a doctor called Robert Mackenzie who had a patient come visit him with low back pain. Would you mind sharing that story with us?
Yeah, it's from a book by Robin Mckenzie called Treat Your Own Back. It's one of the books I recommend when I teach the anatomy workshop. And what I love about it is that it's written for the layperson. It's open-minded. It doesn't assume that it's going to fix everybody's back pain. Mm-hmm. And Robin Mckenzie, who is the author of that book, actually passed away this past year. He's from Wellington, New Zealand, and the story that he shares in his book, which was the discovery of what has come to be known as the Mckenzie Technique, and there are certified Mckenzie therapists out there. The story goes that a man came into his clinic suffering from low back pain in his buttocks and down his leg, a classic case of sciatica, basically, and was told to go to one of the treatment rooms for evaluation. And when he went into the treatment room, the table was elevated on one end. And when this client went in and laid down, he laid down on his stomach with the chest on the elevated part of the table, which is pretty counterintuitive for somebody in back pain. So I have no idea why this person did it, but they did. And it took Mackenzie, 3 to 5 minutes to make his way into the evaluation room. And when he did, the client's pain was completely gone.
Wow.
Yeah, and it wasn't a magic table. The nutshell version is that what this person had done was reestablish their lumbar curve, and for that period of time, the disc that was in fact herniated had receded enough that it wasn't placing pressure on the nerve root anymore, and so his pain had dissipated. Of course, when he stood up and went back to normal position, the pain started to come back. But it led Mackenzie. Mackenzie's my kind of guy, right? He looks at that and he goes, "Oh, I'll just have everybody lay down on their stomach." No, he now that's the new fix for everybody's back pain. He's much more measured about it. He did a lot of research. It took him a while, I'm sure, to figure out exactly what was going on in this first client that happened to. And in the beginning of his book, he asked 10 questions. And if you answer positively to, I think, more than 7 or 8 of those, chances are the book will help you. And it's very common. I've given the book, I've shared the book with so many people who show up with those very classic symptoms. And they usually have jobs where they are sitting for long periods of the day. whether it be a computer or driving or whatever it is. And essentially what happens is your abdominal muscles get short and tight, as do your hip flexors on the front of your thighs that attach to your pelvis. And it creates compression on the front of the vertebrae in the lumbar spine and can lead to the disc herniating and moving backwards and out to the side.
So just by sitting down for long periods of time, you could be like slouching over because you're not respecting this lower back curve of the spine. You can be potentially at risk of serious back pain.
Yeah, you certainly increase the potential for back pain. Absolutely.
And I mean, I found that story fascinating because in the DVD, I remember you said when Mackenzie came into the room, he was mortified to see the patient laying down in that position, which was sort of funny. And it took him a while to get the medical community to accept that what he found was actually real, right?
As far as my understanding is, it's taken a while for it to get out there, and it's still almost always trumped by the instruction to strengthen your core.
Right.
And it's important to say that, for somebody who has a disc herniation, especially in the acute phase of it, strengthening your core could be a really bad idea. And I say that not long term, but in the short term, because most people, when they think of strengthening their core, they think of doing sit-ups and crunches and that kind of exercise.
Right.
That can load a lot of pressure and stress on your lumbar spine. And if that happens while you have a herniation or you're more susceptible to a herniation, can be extremely problematic and very dangerous.
So respecting the curvature of the lower spine and also the curvature of the cervical, the behind the neck, the natural curve. Would you say if we become very aware throughout the day that those curves are natural and in the right place, that we can somehow prevent future issues with back pain?
It certainly sends us in that direction. And the other thing to consider is that, if you're doing some type of movement activity, such as yoga, you're also creating a rebalance, if you will. So if you sit for 8 hours a day, but you do an hour and a half of yoga, you're taking away at least, half of those hours of sitting.
Right.
Right? Because your muscle tissue is healthier and you're generally more flexible, or your tissues are more resilient to being out of position. And it's not that your body can't do it. It can.
Right.
It's usually the long-term effect of doing that. So
absolutely. I think of yoga, particularly the asana practice, I think of it as insurance, literally.
Yeah, I agree with you. It should generally be seen as insurance for health.
Right. And of the real kind too, because you become so aware of every little thing that's happening through a daily practice. And it's fascinating, actually. I mean, I'm telling you, reading your book gave me a whole new love for my body. I used to be I'm very conscious of maybe, I don't look like the models, and I have little things here and little things there. But after reading the book, I get this new appreciation for what it does. And I started going, wow, my body can do all of these things, and having moments where I literally have to stop on the mat and be in awe that my body can do these things, and that anybody has the potential of doing any of these things with time, with dedication, with right alignment, with paying attention, and so on.
Sure. Yeah, it's the body is amazing. Yoga is amazing. When you put the two together, it's spectacular.
Yes.
Yeah, it's spectacular. I mean, every time I teach, I've taught my anatomy workshop hundreds of times now. It's well over 300 times.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I have to keep digging and looking for, keeping it interesting for myself. And every time I teach, the muscular system and just the basic physiology of how a muscle contracts, and the fact that it's, basically a nerve stimulation, releasing calcium, changing the charge relative to two types of protein, and that causes all of the muscular contraction that we do. It just blows my mind.
Right. You're definitely at a deeper level than me, because I got a little lost there. But I can totally relate to the feeling of suddenly finding, oh my God, there is my quadriceps. Wow, look at it. It's like aha moment after aha moment. It's amazing. Let me ask you, David, personally, have you ever opened a dead body, a cadaver, to look at things?
No, I haven't.
I'm scared of that. I don't think I want to do it. But
I'm not scared of it. I've just gotten too busy and I need to schedule. In fact, this last week I was away teaching a workshop, and one of the students there, who's a body worker, she in fact just emailed me a form to sign up for a cadaver dissection workshop with a man named Gil Headley, who most people know from the Fuzz speech that is on YouTube. Yeah, he does cadaver dissections, and even as a yoga teacher, I'm pretty sure you can go do them. And it's been on my list for years. Since I was in massage school, I wanted to go do it. It's just never worked out with timing and my schedule and getting stuff done. But I'm going to make an effort this year to do it.
Wow, that's very interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned him, because he talks about how if you don't stretch the fascia or the tissues of your body on a regular basis, then they condense. What's the word I'm looking for here?
Well, as he refers to it, the Fuzz speech, the layers of the tissue, of connective tissue in particular, which wraps around all of the muscles and everything else. If you don't move it enough, it basically starts to grow together. And that's what he's talking about in the speech. If you don't stretch it out and you don't create movement between your different muscles and the layers of muscles, then this layer of connective tissue will grow together,
right,
and then restrict movement.
So that's why, for example, if you're in an accident or if something happens to you and you have to be in bed for a week or so, then your muscles literally begin to atrophy. Am I saying it correctly?
You're talking about the second part of it. Both you will have connective tissue tightening and possibly starting to grow together, as well as, because you're not using the muscles, they start to weaken because they're not getting stimulated and they're not having to do any work. So yeah, they start to atrophy, which basically means they're slowly dying.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what I'm learning here from this conversation is to stay alive.
Yes, stay alive, Claudia. We need you.
Yes. Movement is very, very important. Movement with intelligence. And also respecting the curvatures of the spine, and for yoga purposes, using all of this awareness for concentration, for going deeper into more subtle levels.
Yep, that is a very good recap.
Let me ask you, David, in your own yoga practice, which has been a long process, what would you say took you the longest to learn?
In terms of posture?
In terms of
mental.
yoga in general. I would say in terms of yoga in general. What took you and it can be anatomy, it can be a body, it can be a mind issue.
I think what took me the longest was acceptance. Really, really accepting what was happening in the moment and responding to it. And not, and I say responding purposely, and not reacting to it. Or in early days, especially with the physical practice, I would be more reactive to the fact that I couldn't put my leg behind my head, or that my back bend wasn't better than it was, or
you
whatever.
You wanted it really fast.
Yes, of course.
Like we all do. I mean, me too.
Yeah, exactly. I because, of course, I was identified with that being advancement in yoga, which I've come to find out really isn't, because I've met enough people who have an advanced physical practice who are not necessarily advanced in terms of mental, emotional development or spiritual development, really.
Right. That's very interesting.
Yeah. Sometimes they do go together quite well. That it certainly can happen that way. But I've realized also that, yoga in that sense is a multi-pronged process. So the asana should lead to something. The physical practice should lead to deeper understanding. That deeper understanding should lead to something else, and that should lead to something else. And so we have this bigger sort of process of unfolding going on. But it doesn't happen if you keep identifying with your physical practice, or putting me in particular, putting my leg behind my head as a measurement of how advanced I was.
Right. You even say on page 267, good news, you say, your enlightenment is not tied up to putting a leg behind your neck.
Yeah, it took me a while to figure that out, just saying.
I'm so glad that you said that, because I would have to agree with you. Acceptance, especially in the beginning years, I suffered from that bag. I have to do fourth series now.
Right.
Very advanced pose. I wanted them all, and it just doesn't happen. And there's been a book recently released with a story. This is a very popular teacher that was taking lessons with a master taekwondo, I think it was. And this teacher had him do the same position 300 times one night. And so this person, who's pretty famous, I can't say his name yet, but because the book hasn't been released, but he said to the teacher, when are you going to let me move to the next posture? And the teacher said, oh, student, this is the next posture. The fact that you cannot tell the difference between how you're doing it now and the last time you did it tells me that you're still a beginner. And it blew my mind, because especially in the Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga system of Pattabhi Jois, there is always this sort of desire to get to the next posture. And perhaps taking this, I realized this is the next posture.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
It blew my mind. So it was as if, I don't know, somebody was speaking to me through some book.
Yeah, no, that's a great quote, great story, absolutely.
So, David, what are your favorite yoga books?
My favorite yoga books?
Yes, yoga books that you refer to, or I mean, one or two. It doesn't have to be.
The one, and I was just using this to teach a workshop this past week, so it's at the forefront of my mind. Every time I read Yoga Mala by Pattabhi Jois, I see things in it that I would swear were not in it the fourth or the third or the second or the first time I read the book.
Wow.
And if you haven't read that book in a while, Claudia, and of course it's me changing. Right. That sees something different in it. And I choose that book. I say that book because for me, it's the most unadulterated look into Guruji or Pattabhi Jois's mind.
I see.
That's why I really love it.
Yeah. I will reread it. I haven't read it in a while. I think it has some things that threw me off a little bit. Like it had some special things about you cannot have sex unless your right nostril is working and the sun is at a certain. It had certain things that seemed to me to be very related to maybe the Brahman branch that he was in. But he also has, in all fairness, a lot of the yoga in it, including the posture. So I wouldn't say it's the most clearly written book in terms of understanding the postures, but every now and again, more often, you just find these little gems of these little philosophical tidbits or things about a posture. You're like, really? Like most people don't realize that, we don't do it anymore, but in Yoga Mala, Pattabhi Jois says in Kukutasana, rooster pose. Can you describe Kukutasana for Yeah. Put your legs into the lotus position, which is cross-legged, right? One on top of the other. Put your arms through your legs. I don't recommend that for beginners, but you would put your arms through and you would lift up onto your hands. So you're standing on your legs that are going through your legs in the lotus, on your hands that are going through your legs in the lotus position. It's a very hard posture to do. It's a very hard posture to do. But while in that posture, he says to do Nauli. Really? Can you describe Nauli?
Nauli is when you draw, you evacuate all the air from your lungs. You suck your stomach in using the vacuum of your diaphragm, and then you roll your stomach sideways.
Also very difficult to do.
Also very difficult to do while in a difficult posture. And most people have never even noticed that it's in there because they don't get that far.
I did not remember that part at all.
I'm telling you, read it. You'll see some gems in there.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think that those are the best kinds of books. And I think your book is that way because when I went back to your DVDs, there were things, I reviewed your DVD as soon as it came out, but I realized it was a much more superficial view I had of it. And I value it now a lot more because my own practice has been deepening a little bit. I'm no expert, but there's been a bit more of a deepening. And so I value every nugget and I get to pick up on different things. So I'll definitely reread this book. And that's Yoga Mala by Patavi Joyce.
Yeah.
So David, I'm very grateful that you agreed to do this podcast with me. This has been an honor to have you on the first episode of the Yoga Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. And so the book is called Functional Anatomy of Yoga, a guide for practitioners and teachers. And I personally, you don't have to believe me, but I recommend that you get the DVDs as well that David has on anatomy, because then it's like a 3D thing. You have the book and you have the DVD and it feels like you have David next to you, and you can't help it. You start striking poses in the living room and grabbing somebody. Let me touch your spine to see if I can sense things, and on and on. Is it down the rabbit hole you go?
Right on.
And David, where do people find you if they want to go to one of your workshops?
The quickest way to find me is to go to my website, which is yoganatomy.com, which is spelled Y-O-G anatomy with one A.
That's a good website. Yoga Anatomy, just one A in the middle. Okay. And you're also on Twitter, Yoga Anatomy.
I'm on Twitter, at dkeil108.
And also at Yoga Anatomy, right?
Yes, I am. Yes, that's right. I'm at both.
So that's in both. Okay. So thank you very much for your time, David. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Claudia.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.